Hey guys, my name's Akiva. I am the knife making instructor here at Hardy and Fuller. A little bit about myself, I've been making knives for close to 13 years. First 6 years of my career, if you can really call it that at that point, I was self-taught. Like a lot of folks, used online resources. In fact, I'd never met another knife maker basically at all during the first 6 years that I was trying to make knives. And for the most part, I was failing until I got to meet some really incredible blacksmiths and bladesmiths at a shop up north called Innovation Forge. My knife making mentor is a gentleman named Steve Roller. He actually still teaches out in Keensburg, Colorado. Fantastic resource on Damascus making, old school American techniques like Bowie knives. And he was also trained by some Japanese smiths who immigrated here to the States, which really got me interested in sort of Japanese construction for knife making. I was also trained by Otto Engel of Innovation Forge, who teaches hammer making classes here at the studio. He's an incredible architectural blacksmith, so instead of making knives, he makes things like gates, railings, stuff you'd see at a big fancy house or a medieval castle. And I still work for him on occasion just to hone those blacksmithing skills. So I have been running my own shop for full-time, at least, for about 4 or 5 years. My store's called Metalwork by Meola, where I hand forge, polish, sculpt. I do the handles myself, batches of chef knives every year. In fact, sort of the high water mark was I made close to 120 knives in a year, which for an American maker is a pretty high production level. Most knife makers here in the States will maybe make 3 or 4 knives a month, handmade at a pretty high budget. But I was really inspired when I got to visit Japan a couple of years ago for my honeymoon and visit some blacksmiths there. Thanks to folks like Elin from Element Knife Company, I got to meet the blacksmith shop in Nara called Kikuichi, which is a blacksmithing company that's been open since like 600 AD, right? One of the oldest blacksmith shops in the world. And I got to meet a bladesmith named Inami-san. And while there, I got to visit his studio. I made this knife with him. This is a single hardened steel with a convex grind on one side of the knife and then a single bevel on the other side of the knife. And you can see they engraved my name here, which is kind of cool. While I was there, one of the biggest takeaways that I got in Japan wasn't what you hear online, which is that Japanese knives and swords are the best in the world and you have to have Japanese steel and all of this. What I thought was so fascinating about Japan in regards to knife making was that it was a place where the average middle-class person could save up a little bit of money and buy a handmade knife made by a real blacksmith and a real knife grinder with an actual handmade handle. And that wasn't uncommon, right? Here in the US, handmade knives are sort of a more precious commodity. It's a thing that collectors buy. It's a thing that is reserved for professionals and people who really appreciate the craft. But in Japan, if you have a passing interest and you want to buy something, you're able to. And one of the ways that they're able to do that is their production methods. What I loved about Inami-san's shop was that it wasn't just a studio where there was one guy making one knife at a time. It was a factory, but a factory that was frozen in time. Instead of using high-end precision milling machines and CNC blanks for all of the blades, he was using raw billets of steel and with mechanical assistance with things like power hammers, which we've just added to the shop, forging out batches of knives by hand. That really resonated with me. The handle construction that he used really resonated with me. Using this sort of hidden tang construction with a dowel to bed the tang inside the knife, I sort of adapted it for my own purposes to make the handle a little bit more watertight than the traditional classic. But what I loved was this mission to not only make something that was clearly, distinctly handmade, something that met the parameters of a refined customer like a chef or a purveyor, but something that was still capable for the average person to save up a little bit of money and take it home with them. So I try to, I love making my showroom pieces. I love making stuff for collectors, but day in and day out, knives like this are my bread and butter. And while for the average person this might still seem a little rich for their blood, um, people who know about handmade knives will see this as a knife that has an easier entry point than a lot of other American makers here. As far as today's discussion goes, we're going to be discussing a bit about the construction of a knife and how I choose the construction for each specific project that I'm working on. Now, for a lot of beginners, it's a bit difficult to pinpoint this, but the construction of the knife needs to be informed by the use of the tool in the end, right? And this goes for any and all blacksmithing projects, but knives specifically, I think this is something that's overlooked by a lot of beginners, is they find cool shapes in media and fantasy and movies, whatever they think looks good, what they've been told looks good on the internet, and they go with that as opposed to really sitting there and pondering what the end use is going to be for the customer here. So we teach a chef knife class. This is a K-tip version. We teach a Western one here at Hardy and Fuller. But people ask me a lot what my favorite thing is that I make. And I've made swords, I've made axes and maces and gates and railings and all sorts of stuff. But I still think that the chef knife is probably my favorite tool. And the reason is it has an end use, right? If I'm making a hunting knife or a Bowie knife, chances are, besides the occasional camping trip or testing it out in the field, processing an animal or whatnot, for the most part, they're going to be on display, kept in a backpack, something like that. Whereas with a chef knife, I'm working directly with people who day in, day out use this as a tool. So there are standards that really need to be met in order for this to be a good, viable object that someone would be willing to spend a good amount of money to have. So I brought a couple different examples here. We've got a petty chef knife with a Damascus steel construction. We'll talk a little bit about that later. We have our K-tip chef knife. That's just full 1084. And then I've also brought some examples from stuff that we make here in class. This one is our integral knife. These were originally a design that I made for sort of a low-budget utility or paring knife that people can kind of keep in their apron or in their backpack, as well as the bushcraft knife, which is basically just a full tang construction blade that we do a full 8-hour class on to show people just the basics of the different processes of making a knife. One of the most glaring differences between these knives here on the table is the handle construction. If we're looking at this chef knife, we see this nice, beautiful curly maple all the way around versus this little bushcraft knife. You can actually see the steel peeking out on the sides of the handle as well as these brass pins to hold those handle scales in place. Now, the full tang versus hidden tang debate is not really a debate amongst professionals. It's a thing that I see a lot online that is discussed regularly, but most professional knife makers know that either construction can be extremely durable. I mean, if you think about it, as long as the steel is high quality, a hidden tang versus a full tang isn't going to change the outcome of the performance of the knife too much besides weight and, in very extreme cases, durability. Something I like to remind my students is that for all of history, swords, things that we use to hack at other people with armor, were hidden tang construction. Full tang doesn't really show up very much historically. There are some examples like the Kriegsmesser in Germany, but for the most part, full tang is kind of a modern thing that was a result of a more industrialized era where steel was cheaper, so you could put some in the handle and just stamp out a full blade and slap some wood scales on either side to make that construction a little bit easier in a high volume setting. But there are pros and cons. So if I'm making a bushcraft knife specifically like this, a bushcraft knife is, in my opinion, a knife that is doing things that knives aren't regularly supposed to do. Hacking through wood, maybe being batoned through pieces of timber in order to split up kindling. stuff that really is reserved for other tools, but the bushcraft knife is sort of that in between a nice fine cutting tool and perhaps a small hatchet or a machete, right? So having a full tang construction means that there's more steel all the way around the handle to help absorb that shock and make this just a little bit more durable. I think it's fantastic for outdoor knives and hunting knives. I think it has a nice look, and like I said, the construction is very simple, which makes this a lot easier to do in high volume settings. Now, the downfall is moisture. So with a full tang construction like this, even with nice high strength epoxy, you still have a seam going all the way around the handle on both sides of the handle scales. So as this knife ages, if it's taken care of poorly, these handle scales will start to split apart, which is why your mom's kitchen knives look the way that they do. You know, sending them through the dishwasher so many times, the wood expands and contracts, and things start to peel apart. When I'm making a chef knife, I prefer a hidden tang design, because as we can see here, there isn't really that much seam to be concerned about. The only real gaps where moisture can get inside is the tops of these handles, and even then I try to fit these up as tight as possible so moisture can't really creep in there. There are all sorts of different methods. The Japanese, their method for it in a really high humidity environment is just to make replaceable handles. Here I use stabilized wood. So this wood has been put inside of a vacuum chamber with a really thin resin, which fills up all of the pores of the wood to make it more durable and, of course, more watertight, which I think is great for kitchen knives in general. Another thing that we can talk about when it comes to construction of knives is the actual steel itself. And Dakota's going to talk about this a little bit more. He's a bit more of a steel nerd than I am. But I did bring two separate examples here. This blade is made out of 1084 high carbon steel, which basically means it has 0.84% carbon. For those of you who don't know, steel has the ability to be hardened after there's a certain amount of carbon sprinkled in, right? Mild steel tends to sit at the 0.1% carbon ratio, but once you get past like 0.2 or 0.3, you can actually dunk that material in water or oil, and it will cool down the steel at just the right rate that you can actually harden them, which is how you get things like drill bits and knives and stuff that can handle a really strong impact. And here we have sort of a demonstration of a much more old world example. This is pattern welded steel, otherwise called Damascus steel. That's another fake debate that most professionals can tell the difference about, and we'll talk about that here in a sec. But if you look at these black and silver layers here, these delineate multiple layers of different steel types, right? Historically, this was a great way to homogenize poor steel, right? If there were impurities in the steel, or maybe more carbon in one part of the billet or ingot of iron than there was in the other, folding it and layering it would allow you to homogenize it. Here, I'm using just modern steels, so whether it's the dark steel or the silver steel, both steel is about the same hardness and has been treated just the same. This is more of an aesthetic choice. But that is sort of an old world method that you could get a really high quality blade out of perhaps not the best materials. Another key aspect in knife making that needs to be determined by the use of the knife, right? That's the number one concern, is what is this thing going to be used for, is the edge geometry. So we probably have to do a detail shot here, but if we look at this edge right here on this chef knife, it comes to like a non-existent point. I have bevels that are maybe 2 inches wide to have a really fine angle of approach. With a chef knife, where we're cutting through food all day, a chef is going to be a lot more tired, a cook is going to be a lot more tired if there's a lot of resistance in their work. So we want to make chef knives a bit thinner, we want those grinds to be a bit thinner, and we want that initial edge to be as fine as possible in order to produce a good high quality knife that cuts with ease, right? If I'm making a bushcraft knife, however, I do want to leave a slight bit more meat behind that edge so that it can withstand that shock. brutally enough, I have actually hammered this blade through solid brass rods and whatnot, and it's maintained its edge because that angle of approach, when it actually comes to an apex, is a little bit steeper. So this is another example of a product that we make here in the shop, or really that you can make here in the shop through one of our classes. This is sort of a rough forged fantasy dagger. It's kind of got some video game inspiration here. And we can see here that unlike our chef knife, these bevels are not actually ground to shape, but they are forged to shape. We call this a brute de forge style. Now, that's kind of a rough term because with the forged texture on this blade, some people will call this brute de forge, but this is what I would call a true brute de forge knife, where the grinder barely touches the knife until it's actually ready to be sharpened. This is a pretty traditional technique. Something that's really important to remember about bladesmithing in general is so much of our traditional practices have to do with conservation. You know, up until very recently in human history, iron was a precious commodity. So if you could avoid grinding it away and you could get that blade to as close of a finished shape as humanly possible, that would benefit you in your shop because you're not spending as much money on materials. So for a fantasy or sort of medievally style dagger like this, a peasant dagger, a forged finish would be perfectly acceptable. Now, the problem with this is by hammering in these angles, you get roughly to where you need to with an edge, but it's not a very consistent, flat, smooth surface. So there are some qualities that are lost by actually grinding the bevels. Also, what's fantastic about modern grinders is they do remove material really quickly, and most professionals who are making knives these days will go with a ground bevel as opposed to forging them. Especially if you're making something like a chef knife, where if you look at the spine of this, the spine is maybe only 2 millimeters thick, more like 2.5, very thin. And when we go to harden those blades, dunking the blades in oil to harden them, the thinner the steel is, the more likely it is to warp in one direction or another. So if we were to forge this down to an ultra fine cross section, down to the edge, these blades would warp like a banana, right? This one is maybe a 1/4 inch thick at its thickest point, so it's a little bit sturdier and there's not as much of an issue of warpage as there would be with a traditional chef knife. When I'm looking at a knife, let's say a customer comes in and brings me a knife to be refurbished or resharpened or touched up, and it's not my own work, there's a couple of key identifying factors in my head that make it a good knife or a bad knife. The first is the use case. If I have a really textured, extremely ergonomic grip for something like a chef knife where you're changing hand positions regularly, that might tell me that the person who made the handle doesn't quite know how a chef knife is supposed to be held. For instance, with my example here, we have this sort of wasted shape. Some people call this a Coke bottle construction. And what I love about these for chef knives is this narrow point followed by this wide swell makes it really easy for a comfortable pinch grip. I've polished the inside of the ricasso or choil of the knife so that the middle finger of your hand rests nice and secure, and that big palm swell fills your hand so that when you're holding it in a pinch grip, which most professional cooks do, it really locks in place. If I pick up a chef knife from a new maker, it doesn't matter if it's Damascus, integral, mosaic Damascus, crazy edges, if the handle doesn't feel good in the hand, then you've already failed the first and most important task, in my opinion. With knife making online the way that it is today, it can be a bit tricky to know what is wanted by a customer and what is just something that is popular. For instance, I've seen come through my shop a lot of examples of knives that hit the check marks. And what I mean by that is they might have a superior blade steel, right? They might have maybe an awesome Damascus pattern, a really complicated one even. They might have an integral bolster, which is where the steel kind of takes up the top portion of the handle to sort of blend into the handle construction, but the edge geometry is improper, the handle construction is improper, the weight feels off balance, and the grinds aren't super even. Even though it's hit those check marks that if I were to post a video about it online and show people the process, people would really see it as a high quality object, the actual customer, when they get it in their hands, might not think so. Another thing that I've noticed with a lot of folks who are working on chef knives, when they begin, is they miss the key essential of how the blade interacts with the cutting, with the material that you're cutting. If it's a bushcraft knife, you, like I said, want a sturdier edge to take a little bit more of abuse. But a chef knife, being thin, isn't enough. Right? I know that this knife is going to be interacting with the cutting board, so pretending that the anvil is a cutting board. If I have a flat spot somewhere in the knife where the rock kind of stops uncomfortably, not only will I have an uncomfortable rock as I'm working with the knife, depending on whether or not I push cut or draw cut or rock chop, I'll also run into an undercutting issue. If the knife is dead flat in one area, as the edge sharpens, the edge will start to recede in that area, and then all of a sudden you rock it against your cutting board and realize that there's a portion of the knife that doesn't even touch the cutting board. Right? This is what happens when a cook is chopping chives and all of a sudden a huge section of them don't separate on the cutting board. What I really love about my own knives is I really try to keep in mind that the end use of the knife is the most important thing, and everything needs to be informed by that. So this, in my opinion, is designed so specifically for the use as a chef knife in a professional kitchen. As far as the handle material goes, we use a really nice durable handle. We have a nice rounded choil here that is polished so that the professional's fingers aren't getting chafed as they're working, holding the blade in a pinch grip. The same thing goes for the spine. The spine is nice and rounded. The blade is 1084 high carbon steel, so a nice carbon steel. It's easy to sharpen, holds a pretty high hardness. I've got this one at around 61 Rockwell. Not as hard as those Japanese knives because I find those tend to be a little bit on the chippy side, but still something that is way better than anything that you could find at your regular box store. On each one of my blades, I leave a little bit of forged texture. Now, this has been cleaned of all scale just to reveal what the steel looks like after it's been eaten away somewhat and forged on here in the shop. I also have a stamp that I punch in on each one of my knives. This is my shield star and anvil. No knife gets this stamp unless I think that it is worthy of having this stamp. This is my signature to my users that this is something that I've certified to be quality, right? The edge is relatively flat. A lot of K-tip chef knives or Japanese knives are meant to be used with a push cut, which means having a relatively flat edge is kind of nice. But again, this is still Western inspired, so I have a little bit of curve at the tip there. So if somebody does want to rock chop this blade, they absolutely can. Those are just a couple things that I think make the Metalwork by Meola knives special. And like I said, I think the most important factor for a beginner knife maker is really consider what is the end goal of the knife. So my take for construction in general, when you're getting into bladesmithing, when you're getting into forging your very first knife, is really allow the use of the knife to inform the design. You don't have to follow a specific pattern. You don't have to be dogmatic and make a knife that you've seen online. There's lots of hot button designs that people are recommending and people are doing regularly, but they're not as important as the basic fundamentals of the knife being a good tool for the specific use that it has.